Protect your team and stay OSHA compliant with PickerPal. Fall protection built specifically for elevated pick modules. Their patent-pending, self-closing safety arms maintain a barrier at all times without batteries or training. With over 60,000 arms in use nationwide, PickerPal is trusted by leading warehouses and distributors. Learn more or schedule a free on-site assessment at pickerpalproducts.com. That's pickerpalproducts.com.
The New Warehouse Podcast, hosted by Kevin Lawton, is your source for insights and ideas from the distribution, transportation, and logistics industry. A new episode every Monday morning brings you the latest from industry experts and thought leaders. And now, here's Kevin.
Hey, it's Kevin with the New Warehouse Podcast, bringing you a new episode today. And on today's episode, I am going to be joined by Alex Vinden, and he is the General Manager of Light Industrial for Instawork, which is a flexible staffing platform for all different kinds of industries, but specifically the warehousing industry as well. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to hear a little bit about Instawork for people that aren't familiar, but we're also going to dive into some of the findings of their state of the warehouse labor report that recently came out. And Alex is going to tell us all about what's going on within the warehousing industry when it comes to that critical piece of the operation, labor. So, Alex, it's great to get you on the show. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Kevin. Thanks so much for having me here.
Definitely happy to get you on. We've had Instawork on a couple times before, but we've never had Alex. So we got a fresh face today to talk about this. But for people that are not familiar with Instawork or haven't heard of Instawork before, why don't you give us kind of a brief overview of what Instawork is all about?
We're a temporary staffing platform, as you mentioned. So think about it as similar to traditional labor, but powered by technology. Mm-hmm. And so the data we get from our workers becomes our comparative advantage. What I like to say is that when you're working with a traditional agency, all the best data that they can get comes off of the worker's resume. And it really comes down to, for warehouse type jobs, workers will just write their experience, whereas Instawork can go deeper and use their actual on-the-job performance to help build a better profile of record to make sure that we are matching the best workers with the best fit employers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's such an interesting approach to be able to add that technology layer that you do to, something that is kind of a necessity in the warehousing world, especially, and other industries too. But oftentimes, like traditionally, could be a little bit of a headache in a sense. I know I've dealt with it myself as a previous operations manager and having to hire temps and things like that. So adding that technology layer, I think certainly makes it interesting. And then you're also getting a bunch of data from this too on the labor market. So tell us a little bit about how you collect this data and how do you leverage that to understand what's happening in the market?
Yeah, so we leverage our internal data, which we collect sort of at the point of booking. So if you're placing an order for a warehouse staff, that first point is we get how much you're willing to pay, and we can see that as a macro lens across the industry, different regions, what are the trends, and for both long-term and short-term shifts. And then the performance data was on the other side that I mentioned, the warehouse workers, we can track their performance at pretty granular levels. So you can see at the individual worker level, how often are they on time, 5 minutes early, 10 minutes late, and you can kind of get those performance scorecards for those things. And then matching with the job description particularly. So a business has posted for a forklift operator role, or maybe a role that requires heavy lifting of up to 75 pounds. You can score their individual performance on those types of work and show this worker excels at heavy lifting, and they've demonstrated that X number of times, or forklift operation, etc. So that's the more granular data I was talking about for matching. And then the macro level data, we can see wage rates for pros and partners over time down to the zip code level at different snapshots of time. When we look at the whole industry, what's happening, what we really like to do is pair the broader macroeconomic data from government reports, etc., and then tie in our local findings and our real-time findings to kind of get a snapshot of where the next layer is going. So when you look back at an announcement of a jobs data drop, Jobs Friday, you see that data is 3 months stale. And so we can kind of add our latest 3 months of data and quickly analyze, is this trend continuing? Is it likely to go? And we often will put out little snippets of what we're seeing there as well.
Interesting. And I think it's so interesting too to see some of that data and that understanding. And you're putting some of that out there through this state of the warehouse labor report, right? So tell us a little bit about the report and what it's kind of all about.
Yeah, so this report really surveyed our customers in the warehousing industry across the US and Canada and just asked them a little bit about what are they finding pain points on in the staffing industry and comparing progress year over year. This is an annual marquee report for us. And so this year, we actually found that their staffing challenges are quite a bit less than prior years. However, the recent tariff uncertainty has created this new form of chaos for them that they don't really understand how to handle and react to. That's causing new challenges that's also heavily impacting staffing.
Interesting. So you mentioned that the challenges were not as much as they have been. So I guess before we get to the, as you said, tariff chaos discussion, because I think we definitely have to touch on that a little bit. But before we get to that, why do you think that the challenges around labor have kind of decreased a little bit? It sounds like is what you're saying.
Yeah, from the macro point of view, we saw really post-pandemic pay rates really got out of control. And so I think it's about up 30% since 2021. Wow. And we saw originally the pandemic came, demand for warehouse labor skyrocketed, and there wasn't enough to go around. So pay rates jumped right up. And then there was an overcorrection and the rates jumped way too up. The labor supply jumped up to meet. Rates wiggled a little bit, but maintained fairly constant. And the supply actually dropped back down and normalized as maybe people went back to their normal jobs after post-pandemic conditions opened up. And essentially what we had in early 2024 was still a shortage of workers. And that shortage over time has really dropped. And so now we don't feel as much of that pressure. The price pressures seem to be continuing almost out of other factors like inflation and expectation of continued pay raises, but not so much based on the labor shortage anymore. So long story short, the labor market is not as tight as it was, and we're seeing that come out in our customers' ability to find staff on their own.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think it's interesting to hear that because for so long, right? I mean, we've been talking about, I don't know how many times on this podcast we've talked about the labor shortage and the rippling effects it's had on other parts of the industry too, and whether that's driving innovation in robotics or systems or automation or just challenges overall trying to navigate that. So are you seeing that these now that these shortages are kind of, I guess the shortage is getting shorter, right? I guess would be the way to put that, right? When you look at that, I mean, are you seeing that? Because I know one thing for sure when I talk to a lot of operators and people trying to navigate this was that there's certainly different skill levels, right, within like a warehouse operation. Whether it's just a plain material handler, which could be almost anybody, to a forklift operator or a specific type of forklift operator. Are you seeing that? Are there any specific type of roles that are, commanding a higher pay or in more demand and the supply is a little shorter?
Yeah, I actually am very glad I have the data here with me because it was quite surprising to see. What you're alluding to, I think, is that the skilled roles may be tougher to find, et cetera.
Yeah.
But the data that we have from our partners shows that 40% of them reported the biggest challenge was general labor type warehouse
Interesting.
role. And the second highest at 25%, 22% is pick pack.
Mm,
So that in my mind is pretty similar. So that puts it to like 60% shows the hardest role is that basic warehouse, pick pack, general warehouse labor was the biggest challenge that
mm.
they were facing across the board from staffing.
Interesting. That's pretty interesting, and I think maybe that makes sense. I guess when I think about it, because I know one of the big challenges was, I mean, during the pandemic, I was a assistant plant manager, and I was struggling to hire people, and one of the toughest things to find were people that were skilled or trained to do, especially like a reach truck
Right.
operator, right, for forklift, and they were certainly like commanding the highest pay because they were hard to find. But part of the thing that we did was, okay, well, let's take these people that are picking, packing, or just general labor, and let's see if we can train them to be able to do that. So I guess maybe what I'm thinking is that like that training and that upskilling is kind of caught up a little bit here, and now it's like a gap on the other side a little bit where people don't necessarily want to do the general labor type of stuff. Is that kind of what you're thinking too?
Yeah, that's what I'm seeing is just like you described, the general warehouse roles are almost used as top of funnel recruiting for
Mm,
the skilled roles, and you're less often going to market needing a forklift operator that you're going to hire externally, and more likely to get your good people to keep going and to upskill them. So it does seem like warehouses have got better at upskilling talent
mm,
and keeping those ones around, but getting fresh talent from the market where they tend to leave the easiest work to the new people. Getting reliable people in the door consistently has been a really large challenge.
interesting. Yeah, and I think too. I mean, when we think about the pandemic, right? I think one thing that it kind of stood out to me is that I think people realized there's like other options that are, in a similar job level, I guess maybe would be the way to say it, that are less labor intensive, right? Like you could, be a gig worker and drive DoorDash or something like that, right? And maybe make close to the same amount of money without lifting heavy boxes all day long, right? Are you seeing, because, from Instawork's perspective, I mean, you guys operate in a couple different industries. I mean, are you seeing certain type of those kind of flexible work roles or gig work roles being favored over others?
We'll be back after a quick break.
Spoiler alert, your team hates manual unloading. And who can blame them? It's slow, risky, and exhausting. Tawi's container unloader eliminates the pain. Lifting loads safely and efficiently from inside containers. Engineered to lift heavy goods ergonomically from deep inside containers, it accelerates unloading while keeping your team safe from strain. Safer workers, faster turnaround, and better efficiency. Better for your people, better for your bottom line. Lift smarter. Visit Tawi.com today. That's TAWI.com.
I think it's not as one to one as you make it sound all the time. Instawork certainly benefit for that exact come to realization there of, hey, these skills I have can play in multiple places from our pivot into warehousing. As in the pandemic, we were purely a hospitality
Yeah,
company and event servers and cooks. And turns out if you got pace in work in a kitchen, you're probably going to be a great warehouse operator, great
yeah,
warehouse
that's true.
worker. But then when the kitchen jobs come back, you may gravitate back to it. But in the temporary space that we play in, the other trade off is that while the jobs are tougher in the warehouse, they tend to be longer term. And so many warehouses have almost constant usage of temporary labor of some sort, maybe outside of their slowest months. But in that form, what we see is people who prefer longer term work end up looking and matching at the warehouses more often, and people who prefer short term, maybe they flex over, but you're not going to be able to be an event server 5 days a week nonstop when we're not always having events. So that little caveat makes it less of a one to one, but we do see that it's certainly on If the work is easier, it's way easier for us to fill. And you start adding in this one's 50 pounds, this one's 75 pounds, and you put them side by side on our platform for the same pay rate. The workers read the description and they choose the easier one and they go for that.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, well, I mean that's like the human way to think about things, right? So it makes definitely logical sense there. So now let's talk a little bit about kind of what you're seeing on the tariff side, right? Or as you said, the tariff chaos, right? In a sense, are you seeing any type of impact from a labor perspective? I mean, are people looking for more labor because they're trying to shift things to domestically, or are they looking for less labor because things are happening differently within their supply chain? I mean, what are you seeing?
I think I call it chaos because the short answer is yes. We're seeing just about everything from different suppliers, right?
Yeah.
So we have a group of partners that are, oh, we're going to shut down this warehouse and move to a 3PL. We have other groups that we're going to do this our own more often. We have other partners that are in lower cost goods, and they think they can't quite tell right now whether, because they sell cheaper things, is the demand from new customers that they don't service today going to increase enough to offset the overall compression of demand that they expect in the market from a recession type event, or if the tariffs just cause everything to go up, people will buy less with the same amount of dollars. So we're seeing the full gamut, but really the main theme that I see is the impacts haven't hit yet with certainty, and so everyone just doesn't quite know what to expect, and they're pausing long-term planning and getting ready. I like to call it they're trying to be an athletic stance to see what the real numbers come in. How can they be positioned to not have just recently made a long-term bet that the ROI is no longer going to pay off, but kind of stalling, being lean, and ready to react to what actual impact is going to be.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think it's really interesting because I'll be honest, you're the second person that I've talked to today that has said chaos when it comes to the tariffs. And I think that, it's interesting to see how people are navigating, right? Because they're trying to, I guess, be proactive, but not reactive in a sense, and it is quite uncertain, right, on what the the ideal model is going to be, and where do the chips fall, I guess, at the end of the day, and what does the actual tariff look like for the long term, right, and from what countries and
Right.
things like that. So I'm curious from your perspective because part of the, I guess, the underlying idea or strategy, right, for the administration around the tariffs is that, to bring more of these jobs into the U.S. market, right? And as you mentioned earlier, you're saying that, we're seeing like the shortage on like light industrial decrease, right? So are you seeing that? Because one of the discussions out there, I think, is certainly that, okay, well, we're going to bring more jobs potentially into the U.S., but, there has been a labor shortage on probably the types of jobs that we would bring. Are you seeing that there will be a challenge there? Will that create another shortage for these roles, or what are you seeing like around that? Do you think that if we create more jobs, whether it's in like assembly or manufacturing or warehousing, are there going to be people out there to fill the roles?
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point. Like you said, we have seen historically a large gap in labor participation in these jobs, and people tend to be looking for the easier jobs, and these are tough. And so I think if the demand for this labor increases, the natural progression there is going to be wages will also have to increase, and manufacturing will be expensive here. I think there's a lot of people talking about just how much it really does cost to manufacture in the US, but it isn't impossible. I listened to the Planet Money podcast about a t-shirt company that's manufacturing in America, and they say in China, where they basically have regions set up that do textiles, and it's kind of all preset. The status quo in America isn't that right now, and maybe it used to be. And so it's just harder work to set up your supply chain, but it is not impossible. So they were able to make a t-shirt and sell it for under $20 all in America. So it is possible.
Yeah.
But I do think that navigating the change is going to be very difficult and cause shocks, imbalances along the way as we work to what could be a new normal in that area. So I would expect to see pay rates for manufacturing roles increase to match increased demand for manufacturing roles just on basic economics, supply and demand. We should see that, and that could help alleviate the supply gap to some extent, but it will be a little bit of a economic and cultural reset to
Yeah.
rebuild these trends here in the US.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think you have a great point there about the cultural aspect, right? Because we were like very strong on manufacturing, right? And that was kind of like culturally was like, oh yeah, I'm going to go, work for a big auto manufacturer, right? Or steel or something like that. And, that's going to be my career and that's going to take care of my family, for the rest of my life and all these things. But then obviously, we've moved towards, more, I guess, innovation, technology, service-based type of roles that are, I guess, culturally deemed more attractive, right? In a sense, right? So now, like you said, it's kind of like it's going to be a little reset, right? To, if you talk to like Gen Z or Gen Alpha, and you're like, hey, yeah, you're gonna jump on the assembly line, right? They're gonna be like, what? Like, you're like, pause my TikTok for a second, and what? What do you want me to do?
Right.
So I think it will be an interesting kind of reset there, and how does that look, and how does that happen? And I think, like you said, certainly the wage rates need to be there for people to get the attraction to these types of jobs. So it'll be really interesting to see how that develops. So I'm curious too. I mean, because part of the discussion too around that, I think, is that it's going to, push some innovation or companies to maybe look at like more automation or more robotics. I mean, how do you work with companies who are leveraging maybe some automation, robotics, but also like filling in some of the gaps and maintaining some of that human element, which is still very, very much necessary in these operations?
Yeah, it's funny. I'll add one anecdote as well is that,
Sure.
like I was mentioning, chaos in the short term and for long-term reset. Right now, we've seen massive decreases in capex and investment in this area
Mm.
because you need to see the ROI
Yeah.
in logistics space. But long term, as you've suggested, innovation is sort of required. So we are in this kind of chasm of uncertainty that people don't know what to do. But long term, if manufacturing is going to be here, there's going to have to be more automation because labor will be expensive. And how do we work with companies like that? It's quite simple, and it's quite similar to the trends we've discussed in the simplest work remains top of funnel, and you get the skilled work all along the line. And automation brings in coaching still and learning systems and getting productive. So we see lots of our partners add in a automation facility, and the last, working with hands and picking and packing and putting into boxes tends to still be manual, or at least a component of it is manual. And so what ends up happening is there's a bunch of fairly simple roles available, but to get productive at them, you have to come in, understand the system, learn some software, and get the pace right, which no matter what takes time.
Mm.
And so what I like to say, like if you're a line cook, it's going to take you a little bit of time to get into the rhythm with a new kitchen, but your set of tools is pretty consistent. You know what a knife looks like. It's probably bring your own roll. You know what a range looks like. It's going to be pretty consistent. But in a warehouse, your skill sets are going to be similar, but each warehouse is so unique
Yeah.
that ramping from 0 to 100 to become as productive as a full-time employee takes several weeks of getting used to it from day one, where you got to do the tour of the warehouse, know where the bathrooms are, know what your coding system is, know how a layout is, and then learning this custom software on your implementation of some sort of sorting machine. And they do great jobs now of making software very simple and easy to use. But regardless of that, it's still something you have to get in the rhythm to and takes time.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great point because it is, yeah, I mean, like you said, you work in a kitchen, right? I mean, there's only so many ways you can cook steak, right? I guess to
Yeah.
give an example, right? But, you go from one warehouse to the other, somebody picks orders this way and somebody picks orders a totally different way, right? Or they have a different scanner that they use or a different software or whatever the case may be. And I think it's really interesting, that point, because those skills, baseline skills, understanding of how a warehouse operates and things like that are there. But then there's a lot of those nuances, right, from operation to operation that need to be learned and need to be taught. So when we look at the times that we're in and some of this uncertainty or chaos or whatever we want to call it, how can companies leverage, flexible labor pools like that, Instawork provides to be able to help navigate some of this?
Yeah, there's two methods that really we can talk about, but it comes down to the theory of being agile. And when you don't know what the future is, and in this kind of chasm where between seeing what the actual results are and being able to recommit to full-time hiring or long-term investments, I think the smart approach would be to simply pause hiring, lean on temporary staffing more until you sort of see what your business's reality is. As I talked about before, we've seen this full spectrum of outlooks and for each different business. And so some business that may think it may need to ramp up hiring, but wants to see the results come in the short term may want to leverage temporary work more. A company that is thinking about the opposite may need to, well, cut temporary work, run on just full time, and then maybe if there are layoffs needed, they can do that and be a bit more confident in the short term that they can flex up as needed. But it's really a challenging time, again, to get through this chasm. And then once the other side is there, what we recommend is always resetting your full-time labor to your slowest months. And so that you're trying to get, maybe February when returns are over and shopping is a little slower, you've got your full-time employees at 100% capacity, and then you leverage layers of staff to get in seasonal workers for 3 or 4 months, make sure they're productive and give them the opportunity to come back as much as they can, and then avoid using 1 day call outs when you have to, until you have to. And then if you've got some sort of summer event for a sale that's just a week or two long, you can then call in that last level, that flexible level that comes in for several days, but doesn't have long-term commitment. And that's how you can kind of maximize your overall output while retaining that flexibility and not having too many expensive full-time employees or overtime hours.
Mm. Interesting. Yeah. And I think, having that flexibility certainly is a key thing, because it's challenging, right, to bring on a full-time employee, and that, it takes time, right? There's onboarding time, there's HR processing time, there's, the training then, which we talked about, right? And then all of a sudden there's a shift, right? And you have to cut the full-time employee. Like that's difficult to do. And, so being able to tap into that flexibility, I think is such a valuable thing to have in your, I guess, in your back pocket, right, so to speak, or your tool belt, right, to be able to say like, okay, well, we know we need, 5 extra people in this department for next week at least, right? So let's tap into like flexible labor and let's, add that in, and that gets us the extra hands there that we need to be able to do that. So I guess, looking at the state of labor now in the warehouse, right, and historically what we've seen too as well from these reports, what can you kind of, I guess, infer, or what can you kind of predict is, the future of warehouse labor? How are we looking like over the next couple of years here?
Couple of years, I think it's pretty hard to estimate the couple of years. Everyone I talk to says they can't estimate it either, as the next few months are going to be telling.
Yeah.
But I think kind of one of two things should really happen is that this short-term impact of empty boats coming overseas land in May through September could be a really tough next few months for the industry as a whole, and where we may see layoffs at logistics companies. But if we find out quicker to react, backfill those supply chains from different countries, or sort out where the goods are going to be coming from faster, I think that is a real question on how quickly can we set to the new norm. And if that can avoid layoffs, we can maybe make more of a status quo than we expect. But if we're unable able to figure out where are our goods going to come from if they're not coming from China right now, and how do we get them in warehouses for this season.
Yeah.
It's going to be tough to maintain current staffing levels across the board. So that's kind of the big question for the next few months that will help us figure out the next few years. But overall, I think the trend for the several years comes to, if there's going to be more manufacturing in the US, there's a lag time of how long capital investment can actually take to come online. You want to build a warehouse, not build a manufacturing plant. You're starting with permits is happening right now. Getting concrete poured will come soon after that, but it's not a 0 to 1 in several months. So I think that's going to take a bit of time to rationalize and really come to what is the new norm. And then the last piece is the cultural reset required to have factory type labor in America. And another key report we recently issued is the state of flexible labor. And it actually talks about the trends, and Gen Z, like you said, working full time in a warehouse or a factory is not something you would tend to associate. And the surprising thing that maybe it's just to me, but Gen Z is 28 years old now, and they just overtook baby boomers and labor force participation.
Yeah.
So that cultural trend is going to be enormous. And that group tends to demand flexible labor way more often than full-time labor. So that's the last piece, is that I think no matter what outcome in the future, the one thing that is going to be necessary is flexibility, both on the employer side and the employee side, partially because the labor force demands it. If you're not adopting something flexible into your workforce strategy, you're going to be leaving out a lot of potential employees who demand that, particularly in the younger generations, which are, now going to be the majority of the workforce.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really interesting to see kind of that evolution and development, because, traditionally when we look at like a warehouse setting, like flexibility around working is like, no, it's just not there, right? It's like, hey, this is your shift, like show up for your shift at this time, leave at this time, right? Whatever you need to do, like either you got to take time off or you got to do it before your shift or after your shift, right? But you need to be there. So it's interesting to see kind of, that development, and obviously, that workforce, that generation, right? Looking at that flexibility, and I know they like that flexibility. I mean, I'm a adjunct professor and I'm teaching some of them, and some of the flexibility they ask me for on assignments, I'm like, I would have never thought to ask anything like that when I was a student, right? And so, it's very interesting to see that. And I think the evolution, would be interesting to see too, as these things develop over the next couple months, and where does the dust actually kind of settle, right? And how does the landscape look for at least a couple years? Hopefully we get some kind of like steady state, right? So people can plan their business and people can do these different things. And so it'd be really interesting to see, and it'll be interesting to see what the report looks like next year too, after all this has taken place, right? So very interesting to talk to you today, Alex, and kind of get some of these insights from the report and kind of what you're seeing in the labor market for warehousing, and just the overall insights that you've provided today. So if people are interested in learning more about Instawork or maybe tapping into some flexible labor, what's the best way to do that?
Best way, I guess, reach out to us. Our website, you can click on instawork.com and learn more about our offerings, and click and talk to somebody from our team. You can reach out to me directly through LinkedIn, through email, and really excited to talk more about what people are seeing in the market and make sure that we're providing the best solutions to get through this area of uncertainty.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll definitely put that link, as well as the link to the report we were referencing at thenewwarehouse.com, as well as in the show notes here. So, Alex, thank you once again for your time on the show today.
You've been listening to the New Warehouse Podcast with Kevin Lawton. Subscribe and check us out online at thenewwarehouse.com.
Enjoyed this episode? Make sure you are subscribed to the podcast, and for more content from the New Warehouse, find us on LinkedIn and YouTube. Links to subscribe can be found in the show notes, and for everything the New Warehouse, head to thenewwarehouse.com.